Well, a warm welcome to all of you to Federation Square for the final of the Archbishop's Conversations for 2017. We start by acknowledging the original custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, knowing that the work of reconciliation needs ongoing commitment. My name is Elizabeth Murray. I'm the Assistant Curate at St John's Anglican Church in Toorak, and I'm very pleased to be your MC for today's conversation. Archbishop Philip Freer is joined today by Sally Burt and Bob Carr for the question, North Korea, the coming Armageddon. The conversation will be moderated by John Cleary. Dr. Sally Burt received her PhD from the Australian National University in 2017 and is currently teaching at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. She is a specialist in US diplomatic history and the development of US foreign policy, both historically and in the current international environment. She is particularly interested in US relations with China and other parts of the Asia-Pacific, contributing chapters on China and Burma to the Hotspot History series, Asia-Oceania volume, which analysed regional tensions and their historical development. She worked with a colleague from Mexico to co-edit 2 volumes, Global Perspectives on US Foreign Policy and Global Perspectives on US Democratisation Effort, which include contributions from the editors and many other international scholars. She has also published other journal articles as well as a sole-authored monograph titled At the President's Pleasure, FDR's Leadership of Wartime Sino-US Relations. Dr. Burt has been a visiting fellow at the University of Florida, and she has also been a fellow at West Point Military Academy in New York, undertaking a program on military history. She is currently working on her next major research project that explores China's role in the United Nations Security Council and hopes this will form the basis of her next book. Dr. Burt is also an active member of the Anglican Church and is a General Synod representative, a member of Archbishop in Council, the Social Responsibilities Committee, and its Disability Inclusion and Access Subcommittee. And she has represented the Anglican Church at the Council of the Church of East Asia Full Assembly twice. Please welcome Dr. Sally Burt. The Honourable Bob Carr is Professor in International Relations at the University of Technology, Sydney. He is the Director of the Australian-China Relations Institute, and which is the only Australian think tank devoted to illuminating the Australia-China relationship. Professor Carr is a former Foreign Minister of Australia and the longest continuing serving Premier in New South Wales history. He received his honours degree in history from the University of New South Wales. He is an honorary professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University, a recipient of the RSIS Distinguished Visiting Fellowship from Yang Technological University and the Fulbright Distinguished Fellow Award Scholarship. He has also served as Honorary Scholar of the Australia-America Leadership Dialogue. Professor Carr is an active public speaker, having been invited to give scholarly presentations at many universities, including Nanyang Technological University, Beijing Foreign Studies University, Shanghai University, and Shanghai Jiantong University. He has been frequently interviewed by international media, and his opinion pieces are published in the Australian Financial Review, The Australian, Sydney Morning Herald, and Nikkei Asian Review. He is the author of Thought Lines, What Australia Means to Me, My Reading Life, and Diary of a Foreign Minister. Professor Carr's research focuses on international relations, foreign policy, Chinese politics and economics, national defence and security. Please welcome Professor Bob Carr. And we welcome back our moderator, John Cleary. John is a former ABC presenter who worked extensively in both radio and television. As a result of his 30 years with the ABC, he is one of the best-known commentators on religion, including his work with Sunday Nights on ABC Local Radio and The Religion Report on ABC Radio National. John's career began in Perth. He was a member of the original Compass team and a co-presenter on the philosophy program Meridian in the 1990s. In 2008, John hosted the Interfaith event hosted by the Catholic Church in conjunction with World Youth Day. He continues to be in high demand as a speaker and moderator, and it is our pleasure to welcome him here today. Hand over to you.
Well, should I begin this morning's conversation with once again reminding you of the title, North Korea, the Coming Armageddon. The footsteps of the Four Horsemen, I think, were heard again overnight as Kim Jong-un introduced us to today's topic with another missile firing. As tensions between the leaders of the United Nations and the United States, and North Korea continue to spiral higher, the prospect of nuclear conflagration or even biological warfare is no longer unthinkable. Even if it remains a worst-case scenario, it is not one the world can ignore. Those lines were written a few weeks ago as the Archbishop thought through this conversation. Archbishop, let me start with you. It's a remarkable prescience in selecting a topic such as that for today. Just to remind us, overnight we had another missile test from Kim Jong-un. Over the weekend we had news shots of a North Korean soldier trying to flee across the border. And here at home, over the last few days, the federal government has released its foreign policy white paper concerned with Australia's place in the region in particular. What motivated you? What are the concerns in your mind that brought this topic as one that should be focused on today?
Yeah, thank you, John. I think to me, as each of these tests happens, the real and likely future risk, if not a present risk to Australia, becomes greater, because as the range of these missiles is demonstrated to be further and as the nuclear capacity develops, I think that we can't just live in, probably as we've lived over the last 50 or more years since the Cold War, with some sort of complacency that, yes, there are a lot of nuclear weapons, they're probably aimed at places. We go to London or New York, we don't kind of think there's an imminent likelihood of those being activated. But I think we're seeing a new situation here of a place where we really don't understand well the kind of controls over these weapons of mass destruction. We've seen in North Korea a willingness for the people, the citizens of that country, to suffer great hardship and abuse at the hands of its leaders. So I think that it is timely we consider what is the effect of just this as one of the windows into the increasing militarization in East Asia, in the Western Pacific. I guess every time, if you look back in world history where there have been things that have erupted very badly, people have become very, if not content, but they've come to rely on old alignments and old way of thinking. So I think that in such changing environments, we need to be as open as we can to new ways of thinking, new alliances, new ways of solving a problem, because it's often the case that the old ways simply aren't fit for the purpose that a new situation and a new threat proposes. And I think we're in something of that environment, and this is one of the windows on it. There are probably many others we could canvass through our discussion today.
Sally, you're a scholar and expert in diplomatic and military history. What the Archbishop said, he alluded to two things. One, some sense of complacency that perhaps we've had over the years, and secondly, a sense that perhaps we ought to be a little more alert, perhaps not alarmed, about the way things are changing. If we look across the world, from the Middle East right through to the Korean Peninsula, the turbulence over the last few years has increased almost exponentially. Is the ground shifting? I mean, are we seeing a paradigm shift in world order, in geopolitical order? And should we be concerned about Australia's place in that particularly?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of continuation of policies that have been going on for quite some time and behaviours that have been going on for quite some time. North Korea's brinkmanship's not a new thing. It's a pattern that we've had for quite some time. I think the changing dynamic is around the sort of leadership and the personality politics that drives or seems to be driving politics at the moment. And there's a bigger insecurity in that we see there's a perception that that leader has much more control and direct control over things. And when you get a sense of comfort when you think that there's a whole institutional base behind decisions that are being made. But as you get that increased perception that it is just a leader making a decision and that's going to result in direct behaviours and patterns, that becomes a much more frightening situation for people. And I think that's where we're heading at the moment globally, with a whole lot of leaders around the world, and that feeling that they are making decisions on their own in a much more isolated way than they are, but it's that perception that that's what's going on.
I'll come back to some of those points shortly. Bob Carr, in your account of your period as Australian Foreign Minister in the Gillard government, beginning in 2012, you introduce us in your diary in the preface with these words: there's a catastrophic descent into civil war in Syria. There is debate within Australia's leadership about our approaches to China and the United States, and this re-emergence of China is part of a larger narrative about the shift of economic clout and strategic weight in Asia. Then, barely 4 days later in your diary, you note, this is the very day a North Korean missile was fired and expired a minute later into the air. That was 2012. It's now 2017. Much of that could have been written in the last week. Yet, if anything, it's now a little worse over those years. Are these all symptomatic of shifting diplomatic plates, and how dangerous is the present situation?
Yeah, I don't think we should be looking for overarching theories here. So I'd steer us away from saying Middle East, uncertainty in Europe, the Trump presidency, the advent of right-wing populism in America, and try to stitch all this together. I'd bring us back onto a close-up on North Korea. I don't think overarching theories help us. Let's have a close-up on North Korea. What is this phenomenon? It is a country opting to withdraw itself from the architecture of governance, world governance. In this case, yes, obviously the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but in addition, the UN system, because they're defying resolutions of the Security Council, which, as we know, have got the status of international law. So one of the world's 193 nation states, North Korea, has opted to fling defiance at the rudimentary system of global governance that we've got operating on this planet. And the challenge is how we bring them back in under the architecture of the UN and nuclear non-proliferation. Well, as Henry Kissinger says, there are two ways of doing it. We've pulled it off with Iran. We've pulled it off with Iran. To
this point.
Yes, and Trump has created uncertainty about that. We won't go into those details. It'll divert us from North Korea, the close-up I want us to have on North Korea. But they left the international system. They said, we're going to go nuclear. And they were persuaded to return under the umbrella of the UN Security Council and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they were brought back into the architecture. The challenge is how we can do that with North Korea. If a nation chooses to withdraw, to walk out on the very rudimentary systems we've got on the planet, making some gesture towards world order, world governance, how do you bring them back?
Archbishop, Bob Carr's referred to that rudimentary world order. We've been trying to get towards some way of managing global affairs for the best part of the last 2,000 years. I mean, the Christian Church was involved in developing a just war theory through St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and others over those years. Do you see those rudimentary... what for you are the important principles that come out of your reading And how are those principles still relevant for you today?
Well, I think perhaps focus on the problematic part of the longer established understanding, and I think that's been problematic for probably a couple of hundred years, but increasingly so, and it is the whole sense of the proportionality in conflict and the likelihood that a military conflict is capable of being decisive and coming to an outcome that effectively doesn't leave everything devastated and worse than it was. And I think that the increasing industrialisation of military technology, which we've certainly seen since the First World War, and I think the advent of nuclear weapons during the Second World War really questions that whole sense of what is proportional. What is a proportional response to a threat? So, and I think in this situation with the present threat in North Korea, these are very big issues. You have on one side, as far as we know, a country which is reasonably unconcerned even for the welfare of its own citizens, and you have broadly other countries arraigned against it that have something of the aspiration we would see about the very low appetite for the loss of human life in conflict. So this whole question of brinkmanship comes into bear. If someone is prepared to threaten a very devastating outcome and then carry it through, what is a proper response to that? And so this whole sense of proportionality and then the likelihood of any meaningful victory, I think is increasingly a questionable proposition in a nuclear conflict. And so, and that was some of the pillars of earlier just war theory, but they're very much in question. And so, earlier on there was a very significant US naval detachment that was being positioned in the Western Pacific. No one really heard much about that, but that was an attempt to, impose a presence, which would be a very effective military presence. But would the US have an appetite for a first strike on North Korea? It would seem very unlikely they would, because all you would need would be some fairly crude response of some North Korean artillery to be devastating in South Korea. So, something which in another way, say something like the Israelis may have done earlier on with Iran, a very tactical strike on a facility, would not seem possible in this situation. So these questions come into play, and I think question much of the accepted state of affairs and even our logical responses to a sense of risk.
Sally, as a scholar of the development of foreign policy and strategic relationships, I mean, the whole edifice of the UN seems to be useless here. It's grown up out of that tradition that came out of theology and other of trying to ask, how do we move towards world peace? You get the idealist vision of a Wilsonian vision of the League of Nations, and then the United Nations emerging out of that with its frameworks, varying from idealism to realism, but haven't proved useful here in this initial instance, or have they? Have we missed something?
I think it's useful. It depends on your measure of effectiveness and usefulness, obviously. And I think one of the things to bear in mind was the UN was created to stop the great powers having a major conflict, which was particularly important once nuclear weapons were on the table. And so, coming back to the just war theory, it's illegal to have a nuclear war. It's not going to be a just war. It doesn't fit into any of those structures for a variety of reasons, and the proportionality of the response. The UN, you could argue it wasn't all that successful at ending the Korean War in the first place, which has led to a lot of where this has all come from anyway. So it needs to be borne in mind exactly what the UN is able to do, what it's designed to do, and how that can be effective in this scenario. I don't think, what it gives is that framework for the discussion to happen. And so when you come back to a preemptive first strike and that sort of thing, and whether the US could tolerate a nuclear North Korea, whether you can bring North Korea, as Bob was saying, into the community of nations and bring them back into that framework in a way that's going to be effective, I don't think we can. And so yeah, it's really coming down to that debate in the US about how far they are willing to tolerate a Kim regime in North Korea with nuclear weapons, which I don't think there's an appetite for. So.
Bob Carr, in your diary, you expressed the view that diplomacy's most important role is, quote, avoiding war and the loss of national sovereignty. Simply put, but damnably difficult. We're now in a situation where, again, in your diary, you state on May the 20th, 2012, with regard to North Korea, and this is 2012, folks, they are deadly serious about nuclear weapons. They are not using this as a bargaining chip. Now, for much of the history of dealing with North Korea, their rattling of the nuclear sabre, or whatever sabre they happen to have, had been treated in foreign affairs circles as a sort of standard bargaining chip. Oh, this is what they do. They ratchet things up until they achieve diplomatically what they want, and then they go back to being just North Korea. You're saying as early as 2012, that doesn't apply on nuclear weapons. It's taken others a little while to catch up with that.
Well, they're determined to secure their regime. Why wouldn't they be, given their instincts? They see themselves at risk. Don't forget, an American president, George W. Bush, declared famously there was an axis of evil. There are three nations that comprised the axis of evil. He then proceeds to invade the one at the top of the list. What do the other two do? What do the other two do? They're Iran and North Korea. They accelerate their development of a nuclear deterrent because they believe, entirely reasonably, that they'll be the next that the ultranationalists and the neoconservatives in Washington will go after. Don't forget, at that time you had a government in Washington that was saying, our victory in the first Gulf War, so easy, our command of military technology, so comprehensive, the prospect of wars without significant casualties, our predominance in all these areas gives us the opportunity to remake the Middle East, to establish an American empire. These were some of this was the aroma coming out of Washington in those heady days. And that produced a spirit that said, we'll go into Iraq, and America did. Now, Iran and North Korea would have been abandoning all the rules that govern international relations if they hadn't contemplated the prospect that they would be next.
But there's one rule that both are sticking to, that is the real politic of the situation, that ultimately it's about power and national survival, as you indicate.
Absolutely. Well, John Mearsheimer in The Tragedy of Great Power Relations laid it all out. It is an environment without rules because, on the bottom line, any nation must safeguard its survival. Any nation must react to a threat to its survival. Look at the book. He laid it all out. And in the end, and a realist like him would say, acknowledging international law, acknowledging resolutions of the Security Council, acknowledging international treaties, it takes second place to regime survival and national security, protecting your sovereignty. All right, so we've got a country that's withdrawn from the international order, and we've got various component parts we can now play with to attempt to get them back. And we ought to start playing with them pretty rigorously, and when the US Secretary of State Tillerson says that there is a back channel of negotiations, we ought to acknowledge that offers some hope, and I hope that's occurring. Some instinct in me says that the Russians have got a role to play here because I think China has no influence with North Korea. It's a bold statement. In theory, they're an ally, but Kim and Xi have never spoken. And a Chinese academic just laughed at me once when I said, but you're allies of North Korea. He said, well, some allies we are. We vote to sanction them in the Security Council, but we go beyond that. We lobby others, he meant Russia, to put sanctions on them and deliver it. So he said, some ally. He said, we've got every one of the 14 nations that we call a neighbour, that we have land borders with, we have better relations with than we have with North Korea. So what moving parts have we got to deal with? The prospect of Russia, not China, as a broker, the prospect of a freeze for a freeze, which the Chinese and I think the Russians have put up there, a freeze on military exercises involving South Korea and the US in return for a freeze of missile and nuclear weapons development. And there are other parts like a commitment on regime, not America foregoing any notion of regime change in the North. Now, there ought to be ways for inspired diplomacy to feed all these considerations into a computer and arrive at a deal that perhaps Russia can be allowed to broker.
That depends on an operating structure that does exist and is coherent and at some level rational. Sally and Archbishop Philip, you both raised the prospect that here we have into this situation something that's somewhat different and unstable, that is understanding the motivations of Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, actors of a different sort. Ironically, Philip Freer, Donald Trump seems to be in some ways falling back in his rhetorical style on appealing to sort of very visceral nationalistic and to some extent primitive religious instincts as part of his way of forging his hold on his population to the extent that he has. Let's talk for a minute about those two actors. Archbishop, first, your sort of ordinary person's visceral reaction to Trump and Kim Jong-un, and then Sally, perhaps some analysis from your perspective as a scholar in the field, watching these loose chessmen on the board. Archbishop.
Well, I think in uncertain times, it's very tempting for anyone to offer false certainties, and so the pumping up of positions to be absolute and to seek to inspire confidence in uncertain time, I think that just happens. And to digress into local politics, but I think that the broad uncertainty internationally probably feeds back. I don't know how, but I think there's something about our collective anxiety, how it stimulates each other. It just means that we've lost a lot of nuance out of public debate. We've got polarised sides, people taking those very quickly, and so I think that in a time of anxiety, it's just probably a natural human reaction to look for some certainty, and a leader seeks to be a strong leader, and I think we're seeing the emergence of even in democratic countries this need to posture as the strong leader, which in a way is mimicking the very thing. If you've actually thought about democracy, you'd be wanting to critique about authoritarian and undemocratic regimes. But I think it comes out of a deep-seated anxiety, but at the end of the day, it probably is quite false. And so I think the challenge for places like us is, as in a way, a significant power, but not a nuclear power, not a great nation like the historic contending states, we may have something which is quite nimble and unique to offer if we are mentally open to that, rather than simply locked into the workings of I think the fairly inanimate great powers and great blocs. So I think there's a time of opportunity for us here to have creativity in our approach to these questions.
Sally, do you see the figure of Trump, and let's concentrate here for a moment, as destabilising American foreign policy, or are the wheels still in motion? Is the foreign policy establishment still sort of working effectively in the back channel sense that Bob has alluded to?
I think obviously foreign policy is always that balance, and it's obvious in the US and their political system between sort of State Department diplomacy versus military and Department of Defence and what the two want to do. And when they're conflicted, it's obviously, and presidents over, long history always have a leaning one way or the other. And I think the State Department is after a diplomatic solution, let's avoid the unthinkable, let's work that way. I'm not sure that the military is not working in opposite direction about let's not have a nuclear North Korea, let's preemptively strike, because we can't allow that actually, that nuclear power to exist. I think, as the Archbishop's saying, it's the role of the allies in the region, the US's allies in the region, to really step in, because I think the danger is with someone like a populist president sweeping up public opinion in the direction of we cannot tolerate a nuclear North Korea, preemptive strike is justified and necessary. And so to avoid that, I think we need the allies of the US in the region to step up and make their voice heard about this is not the direction we need to go in, and our place in the region needs to be secured as well.
Bob, are we making too much of Trump as a figure?
No, because words do count in diplomacy, and because foreign ministries all around the world are looking at Trump and calculating. In Western Europe, American allies are looking at this figure, and they've got to consider that foreign policy is driven from the White House. In Southeast Asia, they've already made up their minds. They've looked at Trump, they've looked at the rise of China just over the horizon, and one opinion poll conducted by a think tank in Singapore of Southeast Asian leadership showed this result. 74% thought China was decisive in their futures, 3% thought America. They're looking at the rise of China and they're looking at Trump. And I follow this closely. There have been two other polls, one just out, we're getting the details, of opinion in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia has made up its mind. America's playing with this pivot is exhausted, and they're living in a Sino-centric region. One of the reasons we've got this China panic in Australia, Chinese tourists here, they're spies, Chinese students in our universities, they're agents of Beijing. 130,000 Chinese students, their noses buried in books. You've had 4 incidents where they've disagreed with a lecturer. In each of those incidents, by the way, the students were right, the lecturer was wrong. But Australia's in panic mode, and we're in panic mode because our sweet little country has never experienced like this in its history, with the exception of the fall of Singapore. All of a sudden, the Navy of an English-speaking, dominant world power is not running things to our north. We've never, part of the British Empire, part of the US alliance system, we've never been challenged in this way. And in this context, Trump is terribly significant, and there's an interesting debate in Australia. This is all enormously interesting, what's happening in our country, and it's not being given the comprehensive coverage it deserves. But those Australians very attached to the US, who see the world through a Washington lens, are desperately saying, hang on to the alliance, Trump will be gone soon. America will revert to normal. And I think realists are saying, in muted voices, because it's terribly impolite to say this to people so wedded to an alliance, in muted voices, just think a bit more deeply. Trump represents a permanent change. It's America exhausted of international responsibilities, America in a retreat from power, an America that's saying from now on, it is America first. It's hard to see a Bob Zoellick or a Hillary Clinton, a liberal internationalist, getting into that White House. It's easy to see someone inheriting Trump's base. The next US president...
Giving it an intellectual veneer. I mean, Gore Vidal was an isolationist to some extent.
Oh, yeah, but he was the only isolationist in America. I taunted him with this. I said, you're the only isolationist in America. Now suddenly things have changed. Someone in my office yesterday said, someone who lives in America, an Australian who's plugged into their politics, said the next American president could be Bernie Sanders. He could be Bernie Sanders. And that would be a left-wing isolationist. America, I suspect, has changed. It's not just Trump. It's not going to go back to normal. Therefore, the presidency counts. You can't write him off. Certainly, the State Department will run some aspects of policy. He'll go along with it. Maybe that's happening with North Korea. But at any moment, with his shockingly flawed temperament, he's able to descend. Can I use a sort of theological metaphor here, like an avenging angel?
Yeah, it's a good one.
Out of the clouds, flinging tweets in all directions.
We'll take that image away. Sally, this raises a question that's surfaced in Australia over the last weekend with the most recent white paper. And the white paper dares to suggest and potentially raise some of those visceral fears that Bob's referring to, the sort of instinctive xenophobia of Australia. That is the fear of the yellow peril from the north in the 19th century or Reds under the bed in the 20th century. It risks tapping a vein, a xenophobic vein, yet the white paper has dared to put its toe in that water. It's saying we must engage but hedge our bets. It's alerting us to the issue of China in a way that perhaps foreign policy documents haven't over recent years. And perhaps, Bob, you could comment on that as well after Sally.
Yeah, I think we do run the danger of that, of heading to the US because it's familiar and it's what we know, and China and Asia Pacific, or Indo-Pacific, run with a China-centric focus is something we don't know how to do. And so rather than go to the unknown, it seems to revert back to let's cling to our alliance very closely with the US, what we do know, and let's keep helping them keep their power established in Asia, which I think is probably a very short-sighted and narrow view of what we should leave as our policy options, particularly in dealing with the region. I think we need to go back to focusing on how do we operate with China, how do we accommodate ourselves into a region where China is the main focus and the leader, and I think that would give us a better long-term prospect of the future. I mean, back on the Trump issue, it's the unpredictability of him comes from not having a good legacy of policy decisions that he's made in power, this being his first elected office. It's there's no sort of history to go back on. So I think that really is actually just as destabilising and just as risky. And as you say, we should get used to this being the more common leadership in the US. I think that alliance is not as certain and as comforting as we sort of make it out, and as the white paper seems to make it out.
But John, I think that Bob was probably instrumental in forming this, but the white paper we had, Australia in the Asian Century, which got totally lost in the politics of the Abbott government coming into power, I think was a real opportunity for Australia to have both a proper outward look at the world and an introspection about what we're doing about that. And it's, to me, very regrettable that in what you understand as the rough and tumble of politics, that became quite discredited and does not seem to have properly informed our national debate over the last number of years. And I think we need to revive some of that thinking, because it gave a very clear challenge that I think we've come close to but walked away from.
Bob, your observations on the white paper, briefly, and in connection with this discussion.
It wasn't as bad as it might have been. It didn't have an ideological edge. Every comment on China this year, from January 26, a speech by Julie Bishop given on Australia Day in Los Angeles, every comment by the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister about China has been negative. And to me, that's just not the language of diplomacy. I wouldn't be second to Julie Bishop in what I said about Chinese behaviour in the South China Sea, but I'd be up there saying it to their faces behind closed doors. But I don't know why we feel we've got to impress Washington by almost incinerating our relationship with China. Diplomacy was invented to enable us to have the best of both worlds. I'll tell you an anecdote. Kurt Campbell, who had served in Obama's first term as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. We're at dinner in the Australian Embassy, he's just stood down, Kim Beazley, our ambassador, presiding. And I mentioned to Kurt Campbell that Julia Gillard has just been to Beijing and she settled on what we call a strategic partnership with China. And I just wanted to make sure he understood that, and we regarded it as important because it guaranteed annual meetings between the Australian leadership and the Chinese. They're the rising power. 190 nations want to get in and have their time. We wanted to guarantee that. And Kurt Campbell said, and he spoke for America at its most worldly, he said, "That's fine by us. You should just be the most desired girl on the block. That is, Australia should be sought after by us in Washington and by Beijing." Now, Americans, like all people, can say different things within a short time. In another mood, Kurt Campbell could say, "Listen, you Aussies, you're getting too close to China." And you hear a lot of that from the Americans too. A young Labor politician, spent a bit of time in Washington recently. Every meeting she had began with a lecture about the danger of China. But it shouldn't be beyond our wit to use the language of diplomacy to have what Sally was pointing to a moment ago, an opportunity for real engagement and dialogue with the Chinese about a range of things. In fact, first on the agenda in our meetings with the Chinese should be the challenge of the Trump presidency and how we as an American ally, they as the rising power, are going to deal with a populist who says our foreign policy is America first.
You earlier said that China may not be a key actor in resolution of the Korean crisis, yet nevertheless China has been part of this discussion, an essential part of this discussion. And the other factor in China is their emergence almost overnight in sort of foreign policy terms, and the dominant characteristic of President Xi in all of this. Let's just touch on that for a moment. Sally, what's your observation about China, and particularly the personality of Xi and the way he seems to have stamped his control on the party and the country, and now he's moving?
Yeah, I think that's providing evidence for the side that is saying this is not a power we want to deal with. They don't do things the way we do. They don't have the same values as we have. We should avoid it. You can then easily throw him in the same basket as sort of Putin, Trump, and other figures around the globe that you sort of say this is not how we do things. This is why we can't work with them. I don't know that that's the case. I think we need to be a bit more creative about the way we think about the world and about how we operate in a new foreign policy paradigm. That sort of thing is going to happen more frequently, and it is the way things operate.
Bob, Xi gives this emergence of China a powerful face, that the figure of Xi can be used to project what China is becoming very rapidly or has already become. How significant is he as a personality?
Well, this is unprecedented. It's going beyond Deng Xiaoping. I suppose the only precedent is Mao, but here's a leader saying we're not going to experiment with democracy. That's not on our agenda, because the all-important thing is the economic transition we're engaged in. People here might be familiar with Singapore and be able to remember a more primitive Singapore when it could be seen as part of the developing world. You go to Singapore now, it's rich like the Western world. What Xi's leadership represents is China saying, we're doing a Singapore, but right across China. So you go to Chengdu, Shenzhen, other secondary cities in China, and all Australians should do it. The purpose of a trip to China is to walk the streets of those cities and see a society that's gone beyond making running shoes and sports slacks. Southern China used to produce 70% of the world's shoes. Well, we're staggered by that. And we think to go from Maoist poverty to being part of the world economy. But that's out of date. They're producing 70% of the world's drones. Within 6 or 7 years, their aim is to lead in driverless cars, in artificial intelligence. There are stories like people going to China, going from Australia to China to get the most up-to-date medical treatment. Now, what he's saying is we're going to be a middle-class nation by 2030. We're going to make the transition that Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore, and before them, Japan made. Keating said in that interview in the new publication, Australian Foreign Affairs, which I strongly recommend, it's going to come out 3 times a year. Keating said, and you know how he's got this arresting capacity for phrase making, and it thrills us even when we think, let me think about that, Paul. It'll take a bit more time. But he said in this, he says, China is simply the most competent government in the world. An OECD nation, that is, the government of the advanced Western world, couldn't have pulled off what they're doing. Now, I don't like saying this because I'm an ideological social democrat. I don't like Marxist-Leninist states, but I've got to recognise where the body of evidence, the weight of evidence lies. They're pulling off something enormous. I think it's shocking policymakers in Australia, especially in the defence and foreign policy establishment in Canberra. What is happening to us? What is going on here? And at the same time, they're providing a guarantor for Australian living standards, because we'd be a pretty dumb nation if we couldn't secure the opportunities for our young people from this transformation that's occurring in China, and it's happening under the leadership of Xi.
Have we reached, in our little part of the world, another John Curtin moment, when we're looking at a great and powerful friend who's changing the way they operate? Curtin looked at Britain, saw the way it was changing.
Well, I am reading transfixed the John Edwards book on John Curtin. It's just out. And don't think I'm recommending it because Curtin's a Labor hero. It's as much about Menzies, the young Menzies. There's a whole chapter devoted to Menzies' visit to the UK in 1935, which is fascinating. So it's really about arguments about Australia's future. We'd been assured that the Singapore strategy secured us in the 1930s. We were safe. Australian cabinets began to get uneasy because it looks like there's going to be a war in Europe. If there's a war in Europe, will there be a British Navy to come out? And the British cabinet said, relax, we're looking after your security. Well, eventually it becomes clear. And reading this book is like reading a thriller to get to this point. It becomes clear that once, of all things, Italy joins the war on Hitler's side, there's a hostile navy in the Mediterranean, and guess what? There are no British ships left over, because if they vacated the Mediterranean to come and save Australia from a Japanese invasion after the fall of Singapore, the Italian vessels would enter the Atlantic and they would help the German U-boats bring Britain down. Australia was very alone. The greatest tragedy in our history was the fall of Singapore in February 1942. And suddenly, I think you're right, it's not a precise analogy by any means, but what's happening has got to have us think deeply about the different strategic environment we're in. But I don't think the correct response is the sort of China panic, Fairfax, Four Corners, the Chinese are here, they're spies, they're taking over.
Sally, I just get your comment on the American relationship with China has been deep over the years. It goes back over 200 years of trading across the Pacific, a sort of cultural fascination with Asia. Can America, will that isolation, that, even if there is an isolationist strand re-emerging, can America really disengage from a country as significant as China?
That's a good question. The involvement has been ongoing for centuries, and it's been, originally based on access to markets and economics and trade, and I don't think that you can disengage from that now. The relationships clearly, whether you then focus back on the trade and the economic side of things without taking the political and cultural stuff with it, that may be an aim. But no, I don't think you can undo the global trading system to the extent of trying to completely disassociate the US and China. And that cultural thing, the fascination came from something, so arguably that's not dead. There's kind of a long history of Americans wanting to get involved in China. The motivations behind that may change, but I don't think you can totally disassociate that relationship, no.
Let me then bring it back to Korea. We started Korea, moved around the ship, and we're back there. Are each of you optimistic or pessimistic about the existential moment that we face? Or are we still very close to tripping over a very dangerous wire? Everybody across the board says nuclear exchange is not, it can't be contemplated. Yet in the case of Korea, they're saying even a conventional exchange would probably trigger a nuclear exchange. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about where we are at the moment?
I think I'm leaning towards the pessimism side, but I think the optimism under that can come out of there's still room to change the game and where we end up. So although I can see great opportunities and through mistake or intention ending up down a path of conflict and preemptive strikes, I think and hope and can be optimistic that there are enough hurdles to that that somewhere along the line the chain can be broken and we can avoid that outcome.
Bob?
Off-ramps, that's the key expression, what Sally referred to as hurdles. What are the off-ramps we've got before we get to the point of a preemptive attack? 1, or 2, a war by accident or miscalculation. I'm a pessimist. We've come close before. There were NATO exercises planned in Western Europe in 1983. It was called Operation Able Archer. The East Germans knew a lot about them. They'd penetrated West German military and intelligence. The East Germans advised the Russians this could be a preemptive strike by the Reagan administration on us. Reagan heard that this was the view being formed by the intelligence services in the Soviet bloc. To his everlasting credit, Reagan cancelled the NATO exercises against the advice of his military high command, just as John F. Kennedy asserted himself over his military command in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And stand at the Kennedy grave in Arlington National Cemetery and just recall that decision and shed a tear for the memory of the Kennedy boys. So there were off-ramps in both those cases. The CIA told me when I visited Langley as foreign minister on 2 occasions, North Korea is an intelligence black hole. Can you help us? So there's no sense in Washington of what's motivating this most curious, sui generis of the world's regimes. So this is a kind of 1914 moment as you weigh all this up. And then the Trump factor, if there's a president who might accept the advice of warlike figures in his command.
Yes, you have Curtis LeMay in the White House.
Curtis bombs away with Curtis LeMay. He was the Air Force commander, bloodthirsty Air Force commander who Kennedy had to stand up to in 1962. But he's, as you suggest, he's now at the White House, the Curtis LeMay figure. So a creepy sense of 1914 and that awful drift into the unthinkable.
Archbishop.
Well, I'll just leave a paradox perhaps to stimulate our thought, but I mean, we're at a time when, in a way, Australia is probably the least optimistic we've ever been about the public contribution of Christianity to anything. Whereas you see, tremendous rise of Christianity within China. South Korea has been often held as a great model of the growth of Christianity. There's sort of a paradox here in a sense that we are known internationally for the harsh treatment of asylum seekers, which seems to repudiate any simple reading of Christian virtue. And I think we've actually got a whole lot of, back channels and people-to-people connections that, in this paradox, we would be least confident about seeing any validity or using. So, to me, I'd like to see the reinvention of our approach to things, just on the basis of some very ordinary human values about seeing other people's lives prosper. What would be wrong to develop a policy towards North Korea that was not about more harshly punishing the ordinary people, but seeing their lives being more tolerable? Why don't we give them some wheat? Do something. They can't fire any wheat back at us, but give them something to eat. Do something decent to people. Why is it that we so I suppose I feel pessimistic about this, I think, lamentable drift of our national character into this kind of exceptionalism, into this kind of public meanness, and a lack of a vision as to how things should happen differently. So I feel more pessimistic when I walk out in the street, in a way, than I do when I look internationally.
Recover the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln, that great president, said. And Bob Carr, I can't let the Archbishop's remarks go finally without quoting you when you were reflecting on a previous crisis in Yemen and what was going on in the Middle East. Muhammad had told his followers that there was a Christian king in Abyssinia. He believed in the same God and he would protect them. This is the dream that must sustain us, that the Abrahamic faiths can rediscover their commonalities. And perhaps that's the point at which we should throw open questions to our audience.
Graham Pratt. I would prefix my comment and question as an ex-Australian Army soldier who in his early years served with many Korean War veterans. And their comment to me was, never again get involved in the war on the Korean Peninsula. Never again. The question I would put to you is, where to from here? It seems to me to be blatantly obvious that Kim Jong-un in North Korea will continue to develop his thermonuclear capacity at several levels. The bombs will get better and bigger, and he will develop a delivery capacity of ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles. He has thousands of artillery pieces aimed at Seoul, which probably have tactical nuclear weapons involved in them. There are no military options here. Let's be realistic. Bob particularly. How do we proceed and engage diplomatically to try and contain this so the lid does not come off?
Thank you very much.
Beautiful question. The conventional answer, let me leap in, I'm pushing the way in because it needs to be said. The conventional answer is containment and deterrence. Containment and deterrence. There's no military option here, as you say. So you've got deterrence. That's based on the assumption that the people running North Korea do not want to commit personal and national suicide. So knowing that you're going to respond, that's deterrence. And second, containment. You contain their power. That's implicit in how we ran and how we won the Cold War. Containment and deterrence, not a military engagement, unless it's forced on us.
Anyone else?
I would suggest going back and negotiating an end to the Korean War. Negotiate a proper treaty that finishes that war. Give it a proper solution and a proper framework, and go from there. And change the dynamic of the discussion and the dialogue.
I'm aware that I think it's called ICANN recently won a Nobel Peace Prize for its stance on nuclear disarmament. That's the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons. An Australian group won the Nobel Prize, even though they weren't congratulated by the Prime Minister for their achievement. I just wonder what your views are on Australia's position on nuclear disarmament, because they're speaking of the UN, as Bob Carr has. He talking about international architecture and for some sort of moderation of the tendencies of sovereign powers to overwhelm weaker actors in the international sphere. I just wonder what your views are, given that we now have Pakistan, Israel, India, various countries that are nuclear armed, and there has been an attempt to get a new decision or treaty or agreement from the General Assembly, at least, I believe, to disarm rather than to control proliferation. I just wonder what your views are on Australia's record on this recently. I believe we voted against the internationally popular disarmament proposal.
I think we'll let our panellists attempt an answer on nuclear disarmament and Australia's position and history in that area.
I think reviving the Canberra Commission is something we should do. It was set up, I think, during the Keating years. It had various international statespeople lodged on it. Michel Rocard, former Prime Minister of France, was one of them, to keep alive the notion of nuclear disarmament, which is, after all, a provision of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1969, to keep that notion alive. Now, people leap on you and say, that's unrealistic, we'll never get rid of nuclear weapons from the face of the planet. Still, Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, the ultimate foreign policy realists, support the notion of working towards a world without nuclear weapons. And as I said, Australia in the 1990s set up something known as the Canberra Commission, that take a lead, comprised of international figures, to produce a discussion on how you might implement those provisions of the Non-Proliferation Treaty that say there's an obligation on the nations that have nuclear weapons to disarm. That would be the way diplomatically we could contribute to keeping that debate alive, as far-fetched as the notion looks.
Yeah, I think it's really significant to keep the discussion going. You can't achieve something you're not aiming for. So if you give up on the idea that you can get rid of nuclear weapons, then you're never going to make any moves towards that, or even the limitations. So, and I think the white paper says, you know, we're quite committed to that policy, and we've been leaders in this area for a long, long time, and I don't think Australia's going to turn its back on that.
Yeah, I think Australia's in an interesting position in that we're a significant exporter of uranium, so we're clearly in the whole nuclear fuel cycle as a producer of nuclear fuel, however used and however processed and however traded and wherever it goes to. So we've got a stake in this, and I think we need a clear moral position that we seem to be a bit unconcerned to really know or publicly declare whether visiting US warships are having nuclear weapons on board. The fairly lamentable state of collisions of the US Navy just in the recent year. It really makes you wonder how safe even having some of these highly armed vessels in waters near us might be. So there are many things I think we're just sort of cruising along without a position, and I think a greater clarity of our moral position in respect of our production and export of uranium, and then our position of a vision of a nuclear disarmed world would be a very important place for us to strive to.
Ian Manning, would any of you care to comment on the religious nature of the North Korean regime? My understanding is that Kim Il-sung had a partly Christian background, and that his regime is founded upon his mystical experiences.
Matthew Francis, it's related actually. It's with regards to the cult of personality that Mao used to establish his government, which Kim Il-sung also copied and has continued into the North Korean present history. But we see now with Xi Jinping's thought being established, which has never been done since Mao, he's basically looking to see as North Korea as an example, perhaps, to follow in developing his own cult of personality.
Thank you very much. So the position of religion in North Korea and the cult of personality in this whole circumstance.
I perhaps don't know a lot about the first proposition of the views of the North Korean leader, but there's a very interesting book called Mount Fuji and Mount Sinai, written by a Japanese theologian, Kosuke Koyama, where he was really exploring the theological principles that underlay the development of the Meiji regime in Japan and the circumstances that led to the Second World War. And his proposition in that is that there is, in broadly, if you want to characterize them as Asian religions, which tend to be more universalist, a repeating order of human souls being born and going through a cycle of life, that there is in that broadly described theological regime some limitations on how you critique a leader. So in the case of the Japanese emperor, the kind of the mythical, the mystical, the theological kind of uniqueness of the emperor, and you see in the cult of the North Korean leaders, however, in the succession, sort of almost like a mythologizing, an inability for anyone to criticize the leader, and I think we're seeing that probably with Xi to a different extent. So the argument in his book is that there is this inherent capacity in a leader who wants to exploit the worldview of an Asian society to put themselves forward as the leader who is different to the populace, who is beyond the critique of the populace, who's accountable in a way to no one because they are in a way authenticated from the divine essence. And he contrasts that to Christianity, which has always a sense, even of the leader, of being under the judgment of God. And Kosuke Koyama was a Japanese Christian and trying to reflect on the horrors of the Meiji regime. But I think that, it's just to say, we probably need more understanding, not so much the clash of civilizations, but that, and I think this is where theology and religion, properly engaged in a discussion and a debate, bring some understanding, because at some very key points, the principles, the legitimation, the way a society operates are affected by beliefs either articulated or unarticulated. So I think there's a very real issue that those questions are touched on.
On analogies with North Korea, I think there are large comparisons to be made between China of the Cultural Revolution and Mao and the peculiar regime in North Korea. China under Mao was comparable to Korea now, but there's no comparison between North Korea and China today. What's being elevated about the leadership of Xi bears no comparison with that leadership cult in North Korea. Just think of the expanded liberties that the people of China have enjoyed since the Cultural Revolution. The party dictated every aspect of Chinese life in the 70s. You couldn't leave your home, you couldn't go from one city to the next, you couldn't conduct a marriage, and you most certainly could not leave the country. You couldn't leave the province without the permission of the party. You couldn't own a plot of land. You couldn't own an apartment. It was dormitory living. Mao wanted to introduce communes in the cities, and he wanted to abolish money. There's even speculation during his rule of giving up names and allocating numbers. China today is becoming a consumer society where even provincial and city governments can be overruled in the law courts with the clear limit that it doesn't allow people to attack the Communist Party. So there's no comparison. There's been a huge expanse in liberties, but it falls short of pluralistic politics, competing political parties and competing political ideologies, but a huge expanse in human freedoms. And we've got to acknowledge that because it is part of the achievement. And of course, for us Western Democrats, it fosters a hope that in 15 years' time there'll be something of a transition in China, a political transition, to reflect the economic transition, comparable to what happened in South Korea and Taiwan and in Singapore, a move towards competitive politics. It's not on the agenda now. So any growth in the leadership cult around Xi would be, by our standards, regrettable. And to arrogate great power to yourself means you've got no alibis if things go wrong. But the Chinese would argue that they're pulling off the most audacious economic transition in human history, based on one, its scale, and two, its rapidity. And they're going to do it under an authoritarian government without checks and balances and without competing political parties. If they pull it off by 2030, according to Western theory at least, there must be a debate as a middle class, a dominant middle class says, we want the right to choose our rulers. One of the fascinations in watching China is to see whether this Western theorising is confirmed.
Well, we've come to the end of our time together. Thank you to everyone who's made today's conversation possible, and thank you especially to all of you for coming along and participating. I will now hand over to the Archbishop to add his thanks and close our time together in prayer.
So thank you for that engagement. Clearly a very big topic and much we could have unpacked and gone in other directions. We are on the short runway to Christmas. I just encourage you, as you hear the words spoken about Jesus, the Prince of Peace, you hear a vision given in the Christmas story, to reflect on how that impacts on us and our own society. Are we a society that is responsive to that and more generous, or are we more fearful and more anxious and perhaps living, even using that language publicly, in a practical atheism that feels quite hopeless about the world and its future? So I just want to close with a prayer commending all who seek peace and seeking to change the hearts of those who are stirred towards violence. Loving God, we thank you for the opportunity we've had to open up this discussion today. We ask that the hearts of those who have hardness towards others can be softened. We pray that there might be new channels and new vision and new opportunities of international diplomacy that can give confidence that conflict can be avoided and managed, that hostility can be prevented, and that people can thrive and grow into the image in which they are created, your image and likeness, an image which is one where they are treated with respect and dignity. And we pray for us as we make our journey towards Christmas, that it be a time of some reflection about our own society, about our own values, about our need for a Saviour and our need for peace. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So thank you. Have a happy Christmas, blessed New Year, and well, we'll come and do this all again next year.